Before we jump into the discussion questions for Chapter 5, we're going to start with a quick summary of the first half of the chapter. So the first half of the chapter was pretty much broken up into two parts. The first is the modern governance framework, and then the second part of the first half of the chapter is just over some of the problems and threats to good governance and good accountability. So the chapter opened up by talking about the new framework of corporate governance. As we all know, with SOX in 2002, it kind of changed a lot of different things about accounting. One of the things that it changed was how corporate governance is practiced. So even before the Enron scandal, stakeholders were putting a lot of pressure on companies to have better transparency, better records on human rights, better protection of the environment, better accountability, and these stakeholder pressures that were being placed on companies really saw their fruition with SOX. And so when SOX was passed in response to the Enron and WorldCom scandals, it put new regulations on U.S. companies or any company traded on U.S. exchanges that they must now comply with. So this new framework was result of decades and decades of stakeholder concerns, and then coupled with an immediate need for credibility to be restored. Scandals are still happening, and we had the financial crisis in 2008 and then the Bernie Madoff scandal. So we see that the framework itself isn't enough, that there needs to be a culture of integrity within companies in order for governance to be effective. Next, the chapter went through an overview of corporate governance. So first it talked about how corporations can be for-profit or not-for-profit, and then they can also be organized as B Corps or benefit corporations. And no matter what form of corporation one is, they all have to figure out some form of governance. And so corporate governance of shareholder-controlled corporations refers to the oversight, monitoring, and controlling of a company's activities, and it's to ensure that the shareholders' interests are met in accordance with the laws and expectations of the stakeholders. So you have to balance the shareholders, but then also the stakeholders. So within the corporate governance overview, the board of directors is extremely important. They are elected by shareholders. They elect the top execs, and like we've already mentioned, I think they have a legal responsibility to represent their shareholders' interests. Within the board of directors, there are three committees. The audit committee, which oversees internal controls and disclosure and make sure the financial statements are presented accurately. The audit committee was established by SOX and required for compliance with SOX. Then there's the governance committee, which oversees governance and different rules that go into that, and that's also a board of directors committee. And then finally the compensation committee, which determines the CEO and other top executives' compensation and base pay. And all of these three committees are required to be listed on U.S. exchanges such as the New York Stock Exchange. You have to be an independent director to be on these committees. So the board of directors have the fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, but there's also the business judgment rule, which has been a result of litigation. So this means that if a director makes a decision that doesn't increase the value for shareholders, they may not, and they're sued, they still might be okay with making that decision, because in general, courts are going to leave directors alone and they're going to think they have the best interest of the company in mind, unless there's some clear conflict of interest. So next, the chapter talked about accountability to shareholders and stakeholders and the importance of both of those. Directors are financially accountable to shareholders, but they're strategically accountable to stakeholders. So that means while it's not necessarily a director's job to be financially responsible to stakeholders, the director must consider how the company's actions affects all the different stakeholders of a company. So they need to examine the trade-off between the shareholders and the stakeholders' interests when the priorities conflict. Next, the chapter discussed the shareholder value myth. And so this is the idea that it is a director's responsibility to increase the company's value for the shareholder. Lynn Stout, a professor at Cornell Law School, did some research on this and found that putting shareholders first hurts investors, the corporation, and the public because there's such a short-term focus on earnings that it can hurt the long-term results of the company. And corporate law has found that there's not actually a huge emphasis on increasing shareholder value because of the business judgment rule. So courts have found that as long as there isn't a clear conflict of interest and that the directors are making objective decisions, that even if they make decisions that doesn't necessarily increase shareholder value, courts will allow those decisions to stand because they trust the business judgment of the director. So in order to take stakeholders' interests into account, the corporation really needs to have the values drive their behavior. It can't just be solely profit focused, but there needs to be a set of values that drives that, and that's the way to kind of have the stakeholder accountability. And so some of the mechanisms is to incorporate an ethical culture and code of conduct. And so the values and the code of conduct of a company can't just be, as the book put it, wall art or a list of 10 things to do, but it has to be reinforced by an ethical culture at the company. So that was kind of the first half of chapter 5. And then it went on to discuss some of the threats to good governance and accountability. There were 3 main things that they talked about. The first one is a misunderstanding of objectives and fiduciary duty. And so just briefly, this kind of went on to talk about having a short-term focus and how that can hurt shareholders, even though it looks like it's helping them in the short run. And then how employees tend to cut ethical corners because they think that that's what their managers want them to do. There's a lot of pressure put on them, and so they cut those corners thinking that that's what is wanted. Then there's also another threat to good governance is the failure to identify and mitigate ethics risks. And so this takes, in order to do this, you need a good audit committee to be able to look at those internal controls and look at the risks in the company and be able to manage those and identify them in order to stop them from becoming a problem later down the road. And then the third and final threat to good governance and accountability is the conflicts of interest. And so this kind of has to do with agency theory, which is where one group of people makes decisions on behalf of another group of people. So because of asymmetric information and misalignment of goals, there might be different decisions made for different reasons, and the agents aren't making the decisions as the principals want, so there can be a conflict of interest there. And then it kind of talked about fraud, and similar to the fraud triangle that we learned in accounting or an audit, they gave 4 steps. And so they use the acronym GONE, which meant greed, opportunity, need, and then expectation of getting away with the crime. And so they kind of talked about how the conflicts of interest can lead to fraud and how those are the 4 factors that they identified in order for a fraud to be carried out. So that's kind of a quick summary of the first half of chapter 5. And now for the rest of the time, we're going to go through some of the discussion questions that were given in the book.